In the year 1893, a single company operating out of Chicago generated an extraordinary $110 million in revenue. That was more wealth than most American cities produced in an entire year combined. If you had walked through the doors of the Armour Plant back in 1890, you would have witnessed something unlike anything else in the world at that time. Animals entered at one end of the building, and by the time they reached the other side, they had been completely transformed into fully packaged, market-ready food products, all carried out with a level of efficiency that industrialists from around the world would travel great distances just to witness. If you find this story fascinating, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel so you never miss stories like this one. Now, let's get into it. By the year 1880, Armour and Company had firmly established itself as the single most important business operating within the city of Chicago. At the height of its power, the company provided employment for nearly 50,000 individuals. Its network of refrigerated railroad cars stretched from coast to coast, connecting every corner of the American continent. The company operated more than 400 branch locations spread across the country, and the Armour name had become a familiar presence on dinner tables stretching from New York all the way to San Francisco. What made this even more remarkable was the fact that Armour and Company had pioneered and perfected the concept of the assembly line long before Henry Ford ever set his sights on the automobile industry. The company produced not only meat products, but also soap, fertilizer, glue, pharmaceuticals, hairbrushes, and dozens of other consumer and industrial goods, all derived from the full utilization of every part of the animal. It was a model of operational efficiency that the world had never seen before. Yet despite all of that dominance, all of that market power, and all of that industrial achievement, something shifted in a direction that no one could have fully anticipated. If you visit the old Union Stockyards site in Chicago today, you will find a quiet industrial park. The grand facilities where tens of thousands of workers once reported every morning are long gone. The animal pens that once held millions of heads of livestock are nothing more than empty, open lots. And the company that once had the power to determine what Americans ate and what they paid for their food now exists only as a collection of brand names scattered across various unrelated corporations. So how exactly does a company that held an iron grip over an entire industry for nearly 100 years simply cease to exist as a unified entity? This is the story of three distinct chapters in American business history. It is the story of a rise built by a determined and highly focused founder who famously declared that his operation used everything but the squeal. It is the story of a peak era under his son, who took a $200 million operation and grew it into a billion-dollar enterprise. And it is the story of a gradual dissolution that scattered the pieces of what was once an empire across the landscape of corporate America. Welcome to the story of Armour and Company, the business that helped teach an entire nation how to think about food production and industrial efficiency on a scale the world had never previously witnessed. To understand how all of this began, we have to travel back to the year 1852 and make our way to the California gold fields located near the city of Sacramento. There, in the midst of one of the most exciting economic events in American history, a 20-year-old farm boy from Stockbridge, New York, named Philip Danforth Armour, found himself standing knee-deep in the muddy terrain of the gold rush, operating a small water management structure known as a sluice. He had left his father's farm with very little in his pockets. The men surrounding him were almost universally chasing after gold, dreaming of the kind of overnight fortune that the California fields had promised. Philip Armour, however, had a fundamentally different approach to the entire situation. Rather than searching for gold himself, he identified a far more reliable and sustainable opportunity. He constructed sluices and water management equipment for other miners, then charged those miners a fee to access and use his equipment. Over the course of 4 years, through this practical and entrepreneurial approach, he successfully extracted $8,000 from the gold rush without ever personally discovering a single nugget of gold. That story alone tells you nearly everything you need to know about the kind of thinker Philip Danforth Armour was. Philip Danforth Armour had been born on May 16, 1832, into a farming family in upstate New York. He had left school at a relatively young age, but he was never deterred by hard physical work, and he certainly was not the kind of person who backed away from a calculated risk. When news of the California gold discovery began circulating through the towns of the East Coast, most young men in his position began fantasizing about wealth and adventure. Armour, by contrast, looked at the same situation and saw something entirely different. He saw the need for infrastructure. He recognized that miners needed equipment and support systems far more reliably than they needed the gold itself, and he positioned himself to be the person who provided exactly that. By 1856, he returned to the eastern part of the country with meaningful capital in hand. He was not yet wealthy by any conventional measure, but he was positioned well enough to begin building something larger. He initially attempted a wholesale soap operation in the city of Cincinnati, but that venture did not develop as hoped. He then relocated to Milwaukee, where in 1859 he established a partnership with a businessman named Frederick Miles in the grain and commission trade. The two men sold salt pork to settlers who were heading westward to build new lives on the American frontier. The profit margins on these transactions were relatively modest, but they were consistent and dependable. Then came an event that would change the trajectory of everything. The American Civil War broke out, and with it came an enormous surge in demand for preserved food products that could be transported to soldiers in the field. While many business people hesitated in the face of that uncertainty, Philip Armour moved with decisive confidence. In 1863, he aligned himself with John Plankington, who had previously founded the Plankington and Plankington Packing Company, and together they established Plankington, Armour and Company in Milwaukee. The Union Army required a steady and reliable supply of meat, and Armour's company was positioned perfectly to deliver exactly that. Revenue climbed rapidly as a result. But here is the moment that most people overlook when they study Philip Armour's career. Near the conclusion of the Civil War, he made a strategic financial wager that would go on to define his legacy as a businessman. Pork prices had risen sharply due to the sustained high demand created by the military. Nearly every speculator on the market at that time was betting that prices would continue to hold at those elevated levels, or even climb higher. Armour made the opposite call. He concluded that when the war eventually came to an end, the demand that was propping up those prices would collapse quickly. He therefore entered into futures contracts to sell pork at the current elevated prices for delivery several months into the future. When the war did indeed conclude, demand fell sharply and pork prices dropped along with it. Armour was able to purchase pork at the dramatically reduced market prices, and then fulfill his prior contracts at the much higher prices he had locked in earlier. Through this single, carefully calculated series of transactions, he generated nearly $2 million in profit. That windfall gave him exactly the financial foundation he needed to build something truly grand. And he already knew precisely where he intended to build it. The year was 1867. And the place was Chicago, Illinois. The Union Stockyards had opened on Christmas Day in the year 1865, constructed on 345 acres of land that had previously been marshland on the southwest side of the city. Railroad lines converged at that location from virtually every direction across the country, meaning that livestock could be brought in from Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, Montana, and any other region of the country where animals were raised, and then processed efficiently in a single centralized location. At the peak of its activity, the Union Stockyards employed approximately 40,000 people and processed 18 million animals in a single year. Philip Armour recognized clearly that Milwaukee was a city with a limited ceiling, and that Chicago was where the future of American commerce was going to be written. In 1867, he joined his brothers in forming Armour and Company in Chicago, and the company began its meatpacking operations immediately. By 1875, Armour had relocated permanently to Chicago and had taken on full leadership of the firm. He expanded the scope of the company's operations to include the processing of cattle and sheep, in addition to hogs. The Armour Plant rose at the corner of 45th Street and Elizabeth Avenue, positioned immediately to the west of the Union Stockyards. It occupied 12 full acres, and at the time, it was widely recognized as the largest manufacturing facility in the entire world. The operation that ran inside those walls was unlike anything else that existed in American industry at that point in history. Animals entered the facility alive and then moved through the building on a system of hooks and conveyors that carried them continuously from one workstation to the next. Each station along the route had a highly specific task assigned to it. Every worker performed the same precise operation thousands of times in a single workday, and the cumulative result was a level of speed and throughput that observers described as almost incomprehensible. Henry Ford, who would later revolutionize the automobile industry with his famous moving assembly line at the Highland Park plant in Michigan, openly acknowledged in later years that his assembly line concept had been directly inspired by what he had observed at Armour's facility. The key distinction was that Armour's line moved in a disassembly direction, but the underlying principle of continuous, station-based production was exactly the same. And Armour had perfected that principle decades before Ford ever applied it to the manufacturing of automobiles. Philip Armour was deeply committed to the philosophy of maximizing the value of every single resource that passed through his operation. His now famous declaration that his company used everything but the squeal was not simply a clever marketing phrase. It was the guiding operational principle of his entire business model. Bones were processed into fertilizer and gelatin. Animal hides were converted into leather goods. Hooves were rendered into industrial glue. Blood was transformed into albumin and agricultural fertilizer. Hair was cleaned and fashioned into brushes. Even intestines were repurposed as sausage casings. Any component of the animal that could not be sold as a food product was redirected into an industrial product that could be sold in another market entirely. This approach gave rise to an entire range of secondary product lines, including oleomargarine, glycerin, ammonia, candles, soap, and a variety of pharmaceutical compounds. In 1878, the technology surrounding refrigerated railroad cars was refined to a point of commercial practicality. Armour recognized the transformative potential of this development almost immediately. The railroad companies themselves were reluctant to invest in building refrigerated cars, citing what they described as insufficient demand to justify the capital expenditure. Armour did not wait for the railroads to come around. He built his own fleet of refrigerated cars, purchasing hundreds of them at significant personal expense. The impact of that decision was nothing short of transformational. Prior to that point, fresh meat could only be transported during the colder winter months, when ambient temperatures would keep it from spoiling. The refrigerated car changed all of that, making year-round transport of fresh meat not just possible, but commercially reliable. Armour opened additional branch packing facilities in Kansas City, St. Louis, and Cincinnati, and established business offices in New York, Liverpool, and London. Fresh meat processed in Chicago could now reach consumers in Boston, San Francisco, and even across the Atlantic Ocean in European markets. The company was not merely growing, it was fundamentally redefining the entire system by which food was distributed across America and beyond. By 1880, Armour and Company had cemented its position as Chicago's most consequential and influential business enterprise. The company played a central role in establishing Chicago and its Union Stockyards as the undisputed capital of the American meatpacking industry. Revenue reached levels that genuinely astonished those who observed the numbers. By 1893, the company had generated an estimated $110 million in a single year. Philip Armour's personal wealth was estimated at $50 million, a figure that placed him among the most financially powerful individuals in the entire country. The fortune had been constructed through decades of relentless operational focus, strategic investment in infrastructure, and an unwavering commitment to eliminating waste at every stage of the production process. It is worth pausing here to note that the industrial environment of that era operated under a very different regulatory and labor framework than what we are familiar with today. There were no established labor unions governing the meatpacking sector, no formal health inspection protocols, and no comprehensive government oversight of industrial workplaces. The physical demands placed on workers in facilities of that era were considerable. The work was fast-paced, physically demanding, and conducted in conditions that would be considered unacceptable by modern standards. The compensation offered to workers was a point of significant tension, particularly given the enormous revenues the company was generating. The living wage for a 5-member family at that time was estimated at approximately $15.40 per week, while Armour workers were earning closer to $9.50. During the early 1880s, when workers in the butcher trades organized to seek improved compensation and greater job security, Armour made the decision to part ways with those workers and restructured his workforce accordingly. These labor tensions were part of a much broader national conversation about workers' rights and industrial conditions that was playing out across the entire American manufacturing sector during that period. The company did not become fully unionized until the late 1930s, when a new interracial industrial union was established as part of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, bringing a new chapter of worker representation to the industry. Meanwhile, Philip Armour continued to build his commercial empire on multiple fronts simultaneously. He acquired significant railroad holdings and became one of the country's most prominent grain traders and commodity speculators. He developed the Armour line of canned meat products and began exporting them to European markets. His company's branch network continued to expand across the United States, creating a commercial infrastructure of enormous scale and reach. But even as Armour constructed this industrial empire piece by piece, a challenge was developing that would eventually place his company's reputation under intense public scrutiny. That challenge arrived wearing the uniform of the United States Army in the year 1898. During the period of the Spanish-American War, the United States Army required a substantial and reliable supply of meat to feed the soldiers who were engaged in military operations in Cuba and the Philippines. Armour and Company, along with several other large meat-packing companies, was contracted to supply that meat. The company delivered approximately 500,000 pounds of beef under those government contracts. Several months later, however, an Army inspector conducted a quality assessment of that meat and identified 751 cases of product that had deteriorated beyond acceptable standards. Major General Nelson A. Miles, who was serving as the commanding general of the United States Army at that time, made public statements claiming that the major meatpacking companies of Chicago, including Armour, had supplied chemically preserved meat to soldiers in the field that had contributed to health problems among the troops. An official investigation followed. No definitive conclusion was reached, and Armour maintained his position of innocence for the remainder of his life. The details and materials that emerged from that investigation, along with other research into conditions within the stockyards and surrounding neighborhoods, provided significant source material for a writer named Upton Sinclair. Sinclair's novel, titled The Jungle, was published in February 1906 and quickly became a bestseller. The book portrayed the working conditions and food handling practices of the stockyards era in terms that captured enormous public attention. While fictional and deliberately sensationalized for dramatic effect, the book was rooted in research that Sinclair had conducted personally within the stockyards. The public response to its contents contributed directly to the passage of landmark federal legislation, including the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, both of which established formal government oversight of the food production industry for the very first time. The reputational impact on Armour and Company from the 1898 military supply controversy was lasting and significant. Philip Armour himself would not live to witness the full unfolding of those consequences. His son, Philip Danforth Armour, Jr., traveled to California in January of 1900 to visit his father, who was seriously ill at that time. During that visit, Philip Jr. contracted pneumonia and passed away suddenly on January 29, 1900. The elder Philip followed 13 months later. Philip Danforth Armour, Sr. passed away on January 6, 1901, in Chicago. He left behind a company that provided employment to tens of thousands of people, a company that had fundamentally transformed the way America produced and distributed food, and a company that had pioneered mass production principles that would go on to influence virtually every major manufacturing industry in the 20th century. His estate was valued at approximately $50 million. His legacy, as is the case with most individuals who build things of lasting significance, was layered and complex. He had built one of the first truly global American companies. He had pioneered production techniques that Henry Ford would later adapt and apply to the automobile industry. And in 1893, he had donated $1 million to establish the Armour Institute of Technology, which would later merge with the Lewis Institute to become the Illinois Institute of Technology in 1940, leaving an enduring educational legacy that continues to this day. He left behind a company in the hands of a son whose personality and leadership style could not have been more different from his own.
The year 1901 brought a significant transition to the leadership of Armour and Company. Jonathan Ogden Armour, known to those around him as Ogden, assumed the presidency of the company upon the passing of his father. He was 37 years old at the time. He had been born on November 11, 1863, in Milwaukee, the same year his father had entered the meatpacking business. He had studied at Yale University, but had departed before completing his degree. He had interned at Armour and Company and formally become a partner in the firm in 1884. But Ogden Armour was a fundamentally different kind of person than his father. Philip Sr. had been an entirely self-made individual, rising from the humble origins of a farm boy in upstate New York to become one of the most powerful industrialists in American history. He had maintained a demanding schedule throughout his career and had approached competition with fierce determination. He had known every aspect of the business from the ground floor all the way to the executive suite. Ogden, by contrast, had spent a formative year abroad in England with a private tutor and had come away deeply impressed by the elegant and relaxed lifestyle that many members of the English country gentry enjoyed. Philip Sr. had reportedly confided to the founder of the Union Stockyards, John B. Sherman, that Ogden was taken with the observation that many Englishmen managed to enjoy a comfortable and leisurely life on a relatively modest income, and that Ogden himself seemed to feel that such an arrangement would suit him rather well, particularly given that the family already had more financial resources than they could practically use. Philip Sr. had noted that his son had expressed a preference for retirement. Instead, Ogden inherited the management of a $100 million enterprise. Here is where the story takes a turn that most people would not predict. Despite the significant differences in their personalities and temperaments, Ogden Armour turned out to be a genuinely capable business leader. During the period of his leadership, the company's annual sales grew from approximately $200 million in 1900 to $1 billion by 1920. The company expanded its production facilities across the United States, Canada, and South America. Its operations included thousands of refrigerated rail cars and more than 400 branch distribution locations spread across the country. The years of the First World War brought unprecedented financial returns, and by 1918, there was widespread public discussion about which American family was benefiting more substantially from the European conflict, the Armours or the DuPonts. Ogden appeared on the very first Forbes Rich List published in 1918, ranking 6th on that list with an estimated personal fortune of $125 million. He had completed construction in 1908 on a magnificent Italian-style estate spanning 1,200 acres in Lake Forest, Illinois, which he named Melody Farms. The creation of that property had cost approximately $5 million and included elaborately landscaped grounds, artificial lakes, and facilities for pursuing a range of refined agricultural interests. Armour and Company was, by this point, the largest food products company in the entire United States. Everything appeared to be positioned for continued success. But Ogden Armour was about to make a financial wager that would echo the kind of bold market bet his father had once made so famously. But this time, the outcome would be dramatically different. In 1918, during the final year of the First World War, Ogden faced a situation that bore surface-level similarities to the wartime price fluctuations that had benefited his father so enormously during the Civil War era. But where Philip Sr. had correctly anticipated the war's end and positioned accordingly, Ogden reached the opposite conclusion. He believed that the First World War would continue for the foreseeable future. Acting on that belief, he accumulated significant inventory and entered into contracts based on the assumption that high wartime prices would remain in place. When the war ended in November 1918, demand fell sharply and prices followed. The inventory Ogden had accumulated lost a substantial portion of its value almost immediately. The contracts he had committed to became financial liabilities rather than assets. The timing of events could not have been less favorable. Adding to the pressure, a federal consent decree issued in 1920 required the 5 largest meatpacking companies in the country, Armour among them, to divest their interests in stockyard properties, railroad operations, and public utilities. These had been important supplementary revenue streams for the company, and their forced divestiture came at a moment when the company was already managing significantly reduced cash flow. The combination of these factors, along with the severe economic recession that gripped the country between 1921 and 1922, placed Armour's finances under extraordinary strain. The company's common and voting stock was owned entirely within the family, with 72% held directly by Ogden himself, but the cash flow situation had deteriorated to a critical level. In 1920, a consortium of banking institutions intervened to prevent the company from sliding into insolvency. They restructured the company's debt and operational arrangements, and as part of that restructuring, Ogden was required to surrender majority ownership to his creditors. His personal equity in the company was dramatically reduced as a result. The early signs of these difficulties had actually surfaced during the late autumn of 1919, in a moment that became something of a legendary anecdote among those who followed the story closely. During a meeting with a visitor in his office, Ogden had suddenly interrupted himself mid-sentence to express a wish that he could find some way to earn $500. The visitor was reportedly stunned. This was one of the wealthiest men in the entire country, expressing a desire for what amounted to modest pocket money. By 1923, the situation had reached a point where it could no longer be managed. In January of that year, Ogden was required to step down from his position as president. His successor was a longtime company employee by the name of F. Edson White. Within weeks, reports circulated that Melody Farms was being made available for sale, and that 60 members of the household staff had been let go. Within 2 months, Armour stock was making its way into the hands of creditors. Ogden Armour had arrived at a state of insolvency, with debts exceeding $100 million. His wife Lolita and their daughter Lolita Jr. contributed $7 million toward retiring those debts. The early 1920s brought with them a new controlling owner in the form of Frederick Henry Prince, a Boston-based financier with substantial connections to the meatpacking industry. The Armour family's century of direct ownership and control had come to its end. Frederick Henry Prince had been born on November 30, 1860, in Winchester, Massachusetts. His father had served as mayor of Boston. Prince had studied at Harvard University, but had departed during his sophomore year to enter the business world ahead of schedule. He secured a seat on the New York Stock Exchange on December 10, 1885, and proceeded to build a substantial fortune through investments across a wide range of industries and ventures. Prince had a particular talent for identifying and consolidating infrastructure assets. During the first decade of the 20th century, he acquired a series of smaller companies and merged them into the large Union Stockyards and Transit Company, of which he became chairman. He also held controlling interests in the Chicago Junction Railway and the Pierre Marquette Railway, giving his stockyard operations access to hundreds of miles of rail lines and close to 1 million acres of land. When Armour and Company encountered its financial difficulties in the early 1920s, Prince recognized an opportunity. He acquired a substantial and controlling interest in the company. The Armour family transferred its majority ownership to him, and Prince brought both the financial resources and the organizational stability that the company desperately needed at that moment. Prince also brought with him a trusted associate, a young man named William Henry Wood, who happened to be his cousin. Prince legally adopted Wood and appointed him to lead the company as his designated corporate successor, with the arrangement that Wood would attach the Prince surname to his own. William Wood Prince, as he came to be known, was a junior banking officer and a World War II Army captain with no prior experience in the meatpacking industry. Yet he proved himself to be a highly effective and thoughtful leader of the company during the years of Prince family ownership. Under that leadership, Armour and Company maintained its position as one of the largest and most significant American corporations throughout the years of the Great Depression. When the Second World War arrived and brought with it a sharp increase in demand for processed food products, the company was ready to respond. During that period, it expanded its operations broadly across the United States. At its peak, under the Prince era of ownership, the company employed just under 50,000 people and operated 33 meatpacking plants across the country, with a total workforce of 60,000 people across all of its operations. The South St. Paul facility was the company's largest single plant, employing close to 4,000 workers with an annual payroll of $26 million and contributing more than $260,000 in various taxes to local and state governments each year. The company maintained its position at the forefront of the industry, not simply through the meatpacking operations that had been perfected decades earlier, but also through innovation in areas that most observers would not have predicted. And one of those innovations was destined to become more widely recognized than almost anything else the company ever produced. In 1948, Armour had been manufacturing soap as a byproduct of its meatpacking operations for many years. The production of soap used tallow, which was itself a byproduct of the animal processing work, making it yet another expression of Philip Armour's original philosophy of maximizing the value of every resource. But in 1948, the company's research chemists developed something genuinely new and distinctive. They created a deodorant soap by incorporating a germicidal compound called AT7, technically known as hexachlorophene, into a standard soap formula. This compound was found to reduce bacterial presence on the skin by up to 80% more effectively than conventional soaps available at the time. By reducing the bacteria responsible for converting perspiration into odor-causing compounds, the soap provided a meaningful and measurable benefit that consumers had not previously had access to. The new product was given the name Dial, a name chosen to reflect its claimed 24-hour round-the-clock protection against the bacteria responsible for body odor. Armour introduced Dial soap to the public with a full-page advertisement in the Chicago Tribune, and in a genuinely innovative marketing move, that advertisement was printed using scented ink, allowing readers to actually experience the product's fragrance simply by handling the newspaper. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. One Chicago retailer reportedly sold more than 4,000 bars of Dial soap in a single day following the advertisement's publication. During the 1950s, Dial became the best-selling deodorant soap in the United States, a position it held with remarkable consistency. In 1953, the company introduced a marketing slogan for the brand that would remain in active use well into the 1990s. The slogan, "Aren't you glad you used Dial? Don't you wish everybody did?" became a genuinely iconic phrase in American consumer culture. In 1966, Armour announced its intention to extend the Dial brand into aerosol and roll-on deodorant products, as well as shaving cream formulations. The brand's commercial success expanded steadily, and because of the strength of that consumer recognition, fueled by consistent advertising across magazines, radio, and television, Armour's consumer products operations were formally incorporated as Armour Dial Incorporated in 1967. By this point, Dial soap had become more financially productive than several of Armour's core meat operations. But even as the consumer products side of the business was thriving, significant structural changes were beginning to reshape the entire meatpacking industry in ways that would prove deeply challenging for the company and for Chicago itself. In October 1952, Swift & Company announced that it would no longer conduct hog slaughtering operations in Chicago, citing the declining volume of hogs arriving at the Chicago market and the escalating maintenance costs associated with its older facilities in the city. 3 years later, Wilson & Company announced the complete closure of its large Chicago plant, resulting in the displacement of approximately 3,000 employees. By the close of the 1950s, both Swift and Armour & Company had announced that they would be discontinuing their Chicago processing operations as well. In 1959, Armour formally ceased operations at its Chicago slaughterhouse. Chicago's long reign as the undisputed capital of America's meatpacking industry was coming to an end. The reasons behind this geographic transformation were multiple and interconnected. The most significant was the advancement of transportation technology. The progressive development of refrigerated trucking and the expansion of the interstate highway system made it economically viable for meatpacking operations to be decentralized and relocated closer to the areas where livestock was actually being raised. By 1953, more than 90% of the livestock arriving at the Chicago stockyards was arriving by truck rather than by rail, which fundamentally undermined the logistical advantage that had made Chicago's centralized location so valuable in the first place. Major packing companies responded by relocating their operations westward, establishing new facilities near the emerging feedlot operations in states like Nebraska and Iowa, which allowed them to process animals much closer to their point of origin and dramatically reduce the costs associated with long-distance animal transport. Rival stockyard cities like Omaha, Kansas City, and Sioux City adapted more readily to the new truck-based logistics model, and they had the additional advantage of being geographically closer to the primary cattle-producing regions of the country. During this period, Armour's facility in Omaha, Nebraska, expanded significantly, and that city's meatpacking industry grew to become the largest in the nation by 1959. Labor economics represented a second significant factor in the industry's migration. Workers in non-union operations in other parts of the country were compensated at lower rates than the unionized workers in Chicago, who had organized and fought for better compensation and working conditions over many decades. Companies identified an opportunity to meaningfully reduce their labor costs by relocating to regions where labor organization was less established. The physical infrastructure of Chicago's facilities presented a third challenge. The Union Stockyards had been built in 1865, and by the 1950s, those buildings were approaching the century mark. The equipment within them was outdated relative to what modern processing technology could offer, and the ongoing maintenance costs of aging multi-story industrial buildings were rising steadily. It was simply more economically rational to construct entirely new, purpose-built, single-story facilities in Nebraska than to invest in the renovation of aging Chicago structures that had been designed for an earlier era of the industry. By the late 1960s, annual livestock activity at the Union Stockyards had declined dramatically from the peak levels of over 15 million head recorded in the early 20th century. Operations had become financially unviable in the face of rising maintenance costs and shrinking throughput. Hog trading at the yards concluded in May 1970. The Union Stockyards closed permanently on July 31, 1971, bringing an end to more than a century of continuous operation at what had once been the most important livestock trading center in the world. The iconic stone entrance gate remained standing, but the industry that had given that gate its significance had effectively departed from Chicago entirely. Armour and Company, meanwhile, was navigating its own set of challenges related to ownership and corporate identity. In 1969, General Host Corporation made an attempt to acquire Armour through a hostile takeover bid. That attempt was unsuccessful. Prior to that episode, Armour had also explored a potential merger with Gulf and Western Industries in 1968, but that combination did not proceed to completion either. In 1970, the Greyhound Corporation, a Chicago-based transportation company best known for operating the Greyhound bus service, acquired Armour and Company for a total of $400 million. The acquisition surprised many observers in the financial community, who questioned the strategic rationale for a transportation company purchasing a meat packer. Greyhound moved quickly to restructure its new acquisition, selling $225 million in Armour assets to reduce its net investment in the company. It retained the meatpacking operations under the Armour Foods name and the consumer products operations under the Armour Dial name. Everything else was sold off. The pharmaceutical division was sold separately to Revlon in 1977. In 1971, Greyhound relocated Armour's corporate headquarters from Chicago to Phoenix, Arizona, into a new building that had cost $83 million to construct, marking yet another symbolic departure from the city that Philip Armour had made his home and his base of operations. An interesting footnote to the Greyhound era involves a connection to the world of music. The father of rock icon Stevie Nicks, a man named Jess Nicks, who served as a Greyhound executive, became president of Armour during this period. Meanwhile, William Wood Prince, who had been installed as president by Frederick Prince back in 1958, had passed the corporate leadership torch to executives from entirely outside both the founding Armour family and the Prince family. Greyhound's management style during this period was characterized by rapid diversification into an increasingly broad range of products and services, and the company developed a reputation on Wall Street for unpredictable swings in financial performance. Armour Foods and Armour Dial together accounted for more than half of Greyhound's total revenues, but those earnings proved to be highly variable from one year to the next. The Armour Foods subsidiary, in particular, went through a series of restructurings and management changes that made consistent performance difficult to achieve. By the early 1980s, the situation had reached a point where significant action was required. Greyhound's bus operations had been losing ground steadily to lower-cost air travel options that had become broadly accessible following the deregulation of the transportation industry. Ridership on Greyhound buses had declined by 55% between 1980 and 1986. The company needed to make decisive structural changes, and in 1981, it appointed a new chairman who would oversee a fundamental transformation of the corporate portfolio. John W. Tietz was appointed chairman of Greyhound Corporation in 1981 and was elected to the combined role of chief executive officer and chairman of the board in 1982. Tietz had originally joined Greyhound in 1963 to help develop restaurant operations at the company's subsidiary operating at the New York World's Fair. He had advanced through the organization over the years by demonstrating a talent for improving the performance of operations that were struggling. He was known for applying a rigorous standard to every business unit under his oversight. Each subsidiary was required to achieve a 15% return on equity, and those that could not meet that threshold would be divested. He was committed to streamlining Greyhound's portfolio and making the company more focused and financially disciplined. In 1983, Tietz turned his attention directly to the Armour Foods division. The meatpacking subsidiary had been generating only $10 million in net income on total sales of $2 billion, which fell well short of the performance standard Tietz had established. He initiated negotiations with the company's union workforce to restructure their compensation arrangements, but those negotiations did not reach a mutually acceptable outcome. Tietz then made a consequential decision. He closed 29 meatpacking facilities in a single day. 29 plants, representing thousands of jobs, were shut down simultaneously. ConAgra Incorporated stepped forward with an offer to acquire the meatpacking operations, and an agreement was announced in June. Under the terms of that transaction, Greyhound would receive 3,400,000 shares of ConAgra stock valued at $92 million, with the remainder of the deal value paid in cash, bringing the total transaction to approximately $166 million. The Armour meatpacking empire had found a new owner. The separation of Armour's various business components accelerated through the 1980s and into the 1990s. Greyhound sold the Armour Food Company to ConAgra in 1983 for approximately $2 billion when accounting for all assets and stock transfers, though it retained the Armour Star canned meat business. In 1985, Greyhound acquired the household products business of Purex Industries Incorporated and combined it with Armour Dial to create the Dial Corporation. The pharmaceutical assets that had been sold to Revlon in 1978 were subsequently sold by Revlon in 1985 to a pharmaceutical company that later became known as Rhone-Poulenc Rohrer. Forest Laboratories later acquired the rights to Armour Thyroid from that successor company in 1991, and the remaining pharmaceutical assets eventually became part of CSL Behring. In 1991, Greyhound itself was renamed the Dial Corp. In late 1995, the company's management announced plans to separate the Dial consumer products business as an independent entity. In 1996, the remaining company was renamed Viad Corp., comprising the service-oriented businesses, while the consumer products operation was relaunched as the new Dial Corporation, with its corporate offices relocated to Scottsdale, Arizona. Under a new chief executive named Malcolm Joseph, who had previously worked at Procter & Gamble, the new Dial Corporation went through a period of significant operational restructuring. Following a series of acquisitions that did not generate the expected returns, Joseph was succeeded by Herbert Baum in 2000, who was given a mandate by the company's board of directors to identify a suitable buyer for the organization as a whole. Dial was ultimately acquired by Henkel KGaA of Düsseldorf, Germany, in March of 2004. The food products business of the former Dial organization, including the Armour Star canned meat line, was sold to Pinnacle Foods in March 2006. Pinnacle Foods was subsequently acquired by the Blackstone Group, a New York-based private equity firm, in 2007. ConAgra then acquired Pinnacle Foods for $10.9 billion in 2018. In July 2006, ConAgra had also sold the majority of its refrigerated meat business, including the Armour brand, to Smithfield Foods. The integrated empire had been fully dissolved. Today, in the present year of 2026, the Armour name still exists in the marketplace, but the company that created it does not. The brand has been divided among several different corporations that share no operational, financial, or organizational connection to one another beyond the licensing arrangements that govern their respective use of the Armour trademark. Smithfield Foods holds the Armour brand as it applies to refrigerated meat products. Walk through the meat and deli sections of a grocery store today, and you will find Armour hot dogs, Armour bacon, and Armour lunch meats on the shelves. The name is there, but its connection to the original company that Philip Armour built is purely one of trademark succession. ConAgra Brands holds the Armour Star trademark as it applies to shelf-stable canned meat products, including Armour Star chili, Armour Star hash, Armour Star Vienna sausages, Armour Star potted meat, representing over 150 distinct products sold under that label. All of them are manufactured by companies that did not exist when Philip Armour was operating his plant at 45th Street and Elizabeth Avenue. Henkel, the German consumer goods and chemical company, holds ownership of Dial soap, the product that Philip Armour's company developed as a creative extension of its meat-packing operations. The soap that became America's best-selling deodorant brand, the product whose slogan became a genuine piece of American cultural vocabulary, is now owned by a German corporation headquartered in Düsseldorf. Forest Laboratories holds the Armour pharmaceutical brand as it relates to Armour Thyroid. CSL Behring holds the remaining pharmaceutical assets. None of these organizations are connected to one another. They do not coordinate their activities, share profits, or engage in any form of joint planning. They simply each hold a fragment of what was once a fully integrated and extraordinarily powerful empire. Visit the site of the old Union Stockyards in Chicago today. The original stone entrance gate still stands as a designated historical landmark, recognized by the city as a monument to the industry that once defined that neighborhood and the broader city. Everything else is gone. The area that was once bounded by Pershing Road, Ashland Avenue, Halsted Street, and 47th Street has been redeveloped as the Stockyards Industrial Park. In 1971, a demolition firm spent approximately 8 months clearing a 102-acre site, removing 50 acres of animal pens, auxiliary structures, and the 8-story exchange building that had once served as the commercial and administrative hub of the entire operation. The Armour Plant at 45th Street and Elizabeth Avenue, the facility that was once celebrated as the largest factory in the world, no longer exists. There is no commemorative marker, no historical plaque, no physical acknowledgement of any kind at that location to indicate what once stood there. Just open ground and the kinds of light industrial buildings that would be utterly unrecognizable to the men and women who once labored in the Armour facility. The company that provided employment to 50,000 people at its peak, the company that processed millions of animals annually and supplied food to a nation, the company that effectively invented the concept of the moving production line, the company that made useful products from everything but the squeal, the company that shaped what Americans ate and how they thought about food, has been dispersed into corporate fragments, reduced to brand name labels on packaging, and largely erased from the physical landscape of the city it once defined. But the lessons embedded in this story remain vivid and relevant, and they echo clearly across every American business that makes the mistake of equating current dominance with permanent security. Consider first the lesson about geographic advantage. Chicago's position at the center of America's railroad network made it the natural and logical hub for the meatpacking industry in the 1860s. That advantage was real, significant, and seemingly durable. By the 1950s, however, that same advantage had ceased to exist. The combination of interstate highways and refrigerated trucking had made centralized urban processing economically unnecessary. Companies that had the flexibility and foresight to move their operations westward to be closer to the livestock they were processing were able to adapt and survive. Those that remained anchored to Chicago, treating their existing infrastructure as a permanent asset, found themselves rendered economically obsolete. The geographic condition that creates dominance today may become irrelevant tomorrow. Consider also the lesson about the relationship between founders and their successors. Philip Armour built his empire through a combination of remarkable intuition, tireless effort, and an almost unerring ability to read the direction of markets. His son Ogden inherited a position of enormous power and responsibility, but he did not inherit the instincts that had created that position in the first place. Ogden's miscalculation about the duration of the First World War cost the Armour family direct control of the company. Frederick Prince's family subsequently provided stability and even a period of renewed growth, but the structural forces that were reshaping the industry proved to be beyond the reach of any individual family's ownership. Corporate dynasties rarely sustain their founding qualities across multiple generations, and that reality is one of the most consistent patterns in the history of American business. Consider further the lesson about diversification. Philip Armour built a remarkably diversified operation. His company produced soap, pharmaceuticals, fertilizer, glue, leather goods, and dozens of other products in addition to its core meat operations. Dial Soap grew into a business whose profitability eventually exceeded that of some of the core meatpacking operations. Yet none of that diversification prevented the ultimate failure of the central meatpacking business when the geographic and labor economics of the industry shifted fundamentally. Diversification creates valuable assets that can be sold or spun off independently, and in that sense it has real value. But it does not, by itself, protect a company's core operations from the consequences of structural industry change. The numbers that tell the arc of this story are striking in their scope. From a starting investment of $8,000 accumulated in the California gold rush of 1852, Philip Armour built an enterprise that reached $1 billion in annual revenue by 1920. Employment peaked at 50,000 people. Then came the sequence of change. Chicago operations closed in 1959, the company sold to Greyhound in 1970, the meatpacking operations sold to ConAgra in 1983. and the brand fragmented across multiple unrelated corporations by 2006. 120 years from founding to dissolution. Stand at the corner of 45th Street and Elizabeth Avenue in Chicago today. There is no factory, no smokestacks, no hum of industrial machinery, no evidence of the enormous enterprise that once operated on that ground. Just quiet pavement and commercial buildings that house businesses Philip Armour could not have conceived of. If you make your way to the remaining Union Stockyards gate, you will likely find visitors pausing to take photographs in front of it. They are capturing an image of a monument to something that was once genuinely transformative in American life. An empire that began with one young man's $8,000 stake from the California gold rush, that grew into a billion-dollar operation and fed a nation, that pioneered production methods that influenced a century of manufacturing, that invented one of America's most beloved consumer brands as a byproduct of its core operations, and that ultimately scattered into fragments when the world around it changed faster than the organization could adapt. The rise, the peak, and the gradual dissolution of Armour and Company is not simply a story about one company. It is one of the most instructive stories in the entire history of American business about the nature of dominance, the challenge of succession, the inevitability of change, and the enduring truth that no advantage, no matter how commanding it appears in the present moment, is ever truly permanent.